I'm going to start off looking at this question of can we win social change by voting, our attitude to elections and electoral politics, starting off from the perspective of having been working in the movement to stop the genocide in Palestine, along with many other people, particularly trade unionists. So I think the people we've been working with have all agreed pretty much on the need to stop the supports of our governments, including the federal government and the South Australian state government, support for Israel, the backing of the US and Israel, the weapons trade that goes both ways between Australia and Israel, and then the government trying to deny it, the way they've tried to suppress the movement using slurs of anti-Semitism and the general dehumanisation of Palestinians. And we've all agreed, I think, that a key part of the response has to be mobilising people on the streets in things like rallies and protests, and also that the union movement has a key role to play. There's also a broad consensus that this is only one of many things that we need to be angry with Labor governments about, notably the cost of housing, cost of essentials generally, the racism against migrants and First Nations people that they foster, the way they're approving new coal mines in a climate emergency, the attacks on militant unionism through the CFMEU, and so on. Now, there's been a sentiment coming up, though, that as the federal election approaches, which has to be held by the end of May, that part of the solution to these issues lies in being active around the election. That this is a chance to get revenge on Labor or punish them, and that it's a priority to elect Greens or other candidates, maybe Muslim candidates or Fatima Payman's new Australia's Voice party, people who might take better positions in Parliament and would be in a position to put more pressure on a Labor minority government if that's the result. So what I want to argue is that, yes, by all means, let's put the Greens first when we vote, but that it's a big mistake to put lots of energy into electoral campaigning, that there are other tasks that are more important, and in particular, these very importantly include the protests and union work that we've been putting our energies into up till now. I also want to argue that although we'll probably need to hold our noses to do it, it's very important that we still put Labor close to the top when we vote, probably second. And the fundamental reason behind this argument is recognising that the democracy we have in our society is limited and symbolic. That while it's correct, it is valuable that we have elections and relatively open debate, but we need to recognise that parliaments don't hold decisive power in this society. That real power to run things lies with capital, with the bosses, the people who control the economy and make the economic decisions. And with them, all their supporting, the people supporting them, the media, the senior public servants, the judges, generals, university vice chancellors, and so on. So altogether, what socialists call the capitalist ruling class. And that means that even if you get the very best people elected to government, parliament, they can actually do very little. We can take as an example, it helps show us that the Labor government led by Gough Whitlam in the 1970s. Now, I think it's often overstated just how left wing they were. To the extent that they were left wing, that was largely the result of the movements around them at the time that were turning society over. The strong union movement, the movements against the Vietnam War, for women's and gay liberation, and for Aboriginal rights. But anyway, that resulted in a more left wing than usual Labor government, and even that was too much for the Australian ruling class. So the result was that they sacked Whitlam and his government and ensured a campaign, including a strong media campaign, to stop Labor being elected again. So our organisation's Solidarity argues that our focus has to be on building power capable of overcoming capital. And we see that power in the working class. We see that the capitalist economy only functions through the wealth, profits that workers generate. And that if workers organise together, we can undermine the power of capital. We're inspired by the great workers' uprisings of history, most notably, the highest point, the Russian Revolution of 1917, where workers not only stopped the profits for the bosses, but actually pulled Russia out of the war and started the end of the First World War. And the way they did that was important. They built new organisations, workers' councils or Soviets, that were truly democratic, and meant that ordinary people could have a say in the running of society, the direction it would take, and be part of the work to make that happen. Now, we certainly recognise that's a very, very long way from where workers in Australia are at today. We know here union membership is low, confidence to fight is rare, and most of the time, if workers do have hope, they think that a lot of it's tied up with electing better leaders to Parliament. So when we start looking at elections or formal politics more broadly, our thought is how can we use this to move a little closer to where we want to be? How can we build up the confidence of workers? How can we help at least some of them understand what they're up against and how they hold the key to changing things? Now, we argue when it comes to masses of people, the way they learn, above all, is by being involved in struggle. So this starts with very basic small things, things like, signing a petition, posting on social media, sharing a meme, whatever. But it's better and more powerful if it's collective, if you do it as a group in your workplace or you come to a rally with other people. And it gets much more powerful again when it's collective action as workers, like striking, stopping business as usual and the flow of profits. And we argue these sorts of methods of struggle, they're the best ways to make progress for any cause, including freedom for Palestine. So we always prioritise those things. But we do recognise that elections open up a whole lot more chances to talk about power and politics, to go over why the system's not really democratic, as I've done above, and also, have discussions with people about how to vote and why. We recognise it does actually matter who wins elections, who takes government, and in an electorate, it can make a difference too. If an outright racist candidate or the Liberals win, that is demoralising to any prospects of struggle. On the other hand, if a pro-Palestine candidate or someone who's stood up for the CFMEU wins, that can boost confidence to fight. So we're going to favour candidates, generally not just single issue candidates, but candidates with rounded progressive programs who also recognise the importance of class and the working class. And generally speaking, that's going to mean the Greens in today's political climate. Now, having said that, we have an important reservation about the Greens, which is their shaky relationship with the importance of the working class. So the Greens have a very strong base among middle class professionals and some more individualistic, professionalised workers. There's a tendency among the Greens to talk about the environment or climate as issues that sit above class and make it less important. There are certainly good examples of Greens politicians taking stands like addressing rallies to defend the CFMEU. But in general, from their work and the experience, there's not a lot of trust from organised workers for the Greens. On the weekend, there was a big meeting held by the Greens to launch their campaign in the seat of Sturt, a Liberal-held seat, and to try and make sure that they could win that rather than and defeat the Liberals there. And while it's welcome to see the Liberals get a defeat, you can imagine a campaign that's trying to get Liberal voters to vote Green is not going to be one that talks about class issues. It's going to be one that's trying to take a much more neutral position, middle ground position. So contrast that with the Labor Party. Now, we've seen how terrible it is in government. We know that it's committed to what it calls the national interest. We know that means the business interest over the rights of workers, all of that. But its history and its place in society, it was still created through the bureaucracy of the workers' movement from the trade unions. And even now, trade unions and their leaders have some limited control over the Labor Party through their conferences and through the factions they organise in. And the most important thing, the result of all that, is that millions of workers and unionists do still see Labor as somehow their party. And you see that in the electoral polls that show, by and large, there's still a huge vote for Labor, quite substantial vote for Labor, millions and millions of people, and that tends to be more workers rather than bosses. So for all the limitations of Labor, if we're starting from the position where we say struggle on the ground is the most important thing, we want to mobilise workers, and many workers still look to Labor, then that gives us a reason to put Labor above other parties when we vote. the right wing and the single issue parties. It's the main reason is to remove an obstacle to working with those Labor supporters. We're not arguing with you that don't vote for Labor. We're saying fight on the ground as well. And we need to clearly put the bosses and racist parties under that. Another good reason for voting for Labor is that when you do actually get a Labor government, it's much easier to make the argument that Labor governments aren't a solution to the problems we face, because we see how in practice they're not that different from coalition governments. Now, okay, before we finish, it's important to look at why Labor is so terrible in government. And the key point here is that I think the same logic ultimately affects the Greens too. Now that we said Parliament doesn't have real power against business. And the problem is that most people, most left-wing people, when they get elected, bend to accommodate that lack of power. They start to strike deals, make that their work, to strike deals that business and the state will accept. And we'd argue that's why, because Labor's taking on that role of running the system without a lot of power, that you end up with it supporting the US alliance in Israel. You end up with it attacking unions to keep wages under control for the bosses. Now, it hasn't had a chance to go so far with the Australian Greens, but this same logic affects them when they get elected. And we've had one clear example of many among this parliament over the climate safeguard mechanism and the deal the Greens made there. So this was a policy that Labor inherited from the coalition, was trying to make some tweaks to turn it into something more useful. But the result of the negotiations between the Greens and Labor was that the Greens ended up promoting the outcome as a win, even though the safeguard mechanism doesn't give any guarantees on reducing emissions and allows new coal and gas projects to continue. So it's a pretty shitty deal. And the Greens, to be fair, did recognise it wasn't perfect. But all of their publicity to start with was about, we need you, we are fighting in Parliament to get a better deal. And then it was, we've achieved something here. This is our achievement. Instead of saying what they should have said, which is, this is a critical issue. We need to have a clear commitment to cut emissions, to stop new coal, get out in the streets, fight for this, and not that we've reached this deal. Now that's a good outcome. The problem is that people elected to Parliament start believing it's their skills rather than the masses of people organised that can change things. And this is the reason they end up supporting the things they said they'd stand against. So we agree with people in the movement who have no confidence in Labor. We agree there's a need to build a different left-wing political party. But we think the Greens are not going to be that party because they're set to repeat the same mistakes because of their electoral focus. Our alternative is a party that consistently looks to the power of organised workers, one that does what it can to build that power wherever it can, and works to prepare for a time as more workers suffer the attacks of capitalism and are prepared to fight, to help to lead those struggles and make them effective. And one of the key tasks of that party will be to argue against the old parties, the Labor Party and the Greens, when they start to try to say anger needs to be channeled back into parliaments and elections. So that's the sort of party that we in Solidarity are working to build. We're going to keep on working with everyone, whatever their views on parties and elections, who wants to build the movement for Palestine and other progressive struggles. But we encourage you to join us to help us build this party centred on struggle that we need.